Spy Sorge movie review. So this is one of my scripted movie review series in which I go through my archives and look at movie reviews I've written years ago and see if there's anything interesting to talk about or make them into a YouTube video. So this is an interesting movie about an interesting person. I guess let me talk about the person first. It's a movie about Richard Sorge. Richard Sorge, it's one of those things, one of those fascinating little episodes of history which you don't hear about. Like, you know, I never heard about this in school. Nobody, don't remember this being in any books in America or something like that. Yeah, I think in America especially, this tends to, people don't really talk about it. But then when I was, what is it? Okay. So Sorge was a communist spy in Japan during World War II. He had a complicated family history. I think he had a Soviet father and a German mother or something like that. And he had spent time in both the Soviet Union and Germany. So he was a German citizen, and he was under the cover as a member of the Nazi Party. But in reality, he was a communist spy and was sending information back to Stalin, to the Soviet Union. Excuse me. And so while he was in Japan, he set up a network of communist spies. I think there were five Japanese people in the Sorge ring who were either kind of communists or left-wing sympathizers who were able to give Sorge information. And then also he was in the German embassy because his cover was as a Nazi. So between the spy ring he had in Japan and his contacts in the German embassy, he was able to send some very crucial information back to the Soviet Union. The first big scoop he had was that he found out in advance that Germany was planning on invading the Soviet Union. And he sent that information back, but Stalin refused to believe it. So unfortunately, that information didn't do anybody any good. But then the next big scoop he got was later in the war. The Soviet Union was worried about an invasion from Japan. And Sorge got information that Japan was not planning to invade the Soviet Union, or at least they weren't planning on invading the Soviet Union for quite some time. So he sent that information back to the Soviet Union, and arguably, this information changed the course of history, because the Soviet Union was then able to take the troops away from its eastern front, with kind of the border with China, and just put all the troops against Germany. And then that was kind of the beginning of the end of the German advance. And then shortly after that, the Germans started to kind of get defeated by the Soviet army. Now there are a few kind of contingencies on that if you kind of get into this, and you can look this up on Wikipedia. Maybe the Soviet Union got some of that information from other people, or would have gotten that information from other people anyways, or maybe those extra troops didn't make that much of a difference. So there are some caveats there, but arguably that information changed the course of the war. Quite an impressive person. And then he was eventually caught. He and his spy ring were caught by the Japanese police. And he was executed in Japan. Now, I found out about him when I was living in Japan because he pops up a little bit in kind of Japanese media. He's kind of mythologized to a certain extent in Japan. There's a very famous manga called Adolf by Tezuka Osamu. And this is one of those classic mangas. It was like, I don't remember, in the 1960s or in the 1970s. Tezuka Osamu was one of those classic manga authors. And he wrote a story, he wrote a series of mangas called Adolf, which takes place during World War II, and Sergei is one of the characters in that. So I was kind of reading through that and was kind of fascinated by the story that I had never heard of before about this Soviet spy in Japan. So I tried to look up more information about him, and then eventually stumbled upon this movie, which came out in 2003 called Spy Sorge. It was a Japanese movie, although they used a number of foreign actors to tell Sergei's story. It was a big budget production, at least big budget by Japanese standards, and much of the movie was in English. And I think they had hopes to be kind of a big international hit, but the movie kind of performed very poorly or very mediocre. It's starring, I was just looking this up on Wikipedia, it was starring Ian Glenn, a Scottish actor, and I had no idea who he was at the time when I saw this movie 13 years ago. But I was just looking this up on Wikipedia now, and he's in Game of Thrones now. He plays Jorah Mormont, the Jorah character in Game of Thrones. That's him. So this is him. The movie came out in 2003, so kind of 15 years ago, when he was a bit younger, playing the spy Sorge. A number of other kind of foreign actors in there as well. The director is also quite famous, and I didn't fully realize this at the time, especially because in my review I criticized the directing. But the director is Masahiro Shinoda, who was one of the big names of Japanese New Wave cinema in the 1960s. And in fact, I've reviewed one of his movies on my blog, Pale Flower, which eventually I'll try and work up and do a video review of that one as well. I thought the foreign actors, the directing of the foreign actors was not good in this movie. I think the directing of the Japanese cast was fine. But the foreign actors seemed to be kind of overacting a lot, and it wasn't kind of natural, and I suspect that's the director's fault. Although, again, this is a very famous and respected director, so I don't know. And this was the last movie he made. He was a guy from the 1960s, in New Wave cinema in the 1960s in Japan, and this 2003 movie was the last movie he made. Anyways, now that I've rambled on a bit, I'll just kind of read what I had written at the time back in 2005. I've also been trying to make some inroads into Japanese cinema by renting some Japanese movies. The most interesting one I've seen so far was called Spy Sorge. Richard Sorge was a communist spy who worked at the German embassy in Japan during World War II. Although Stalin ultimately ignored his warnings, he was able to predict the Nazi blitzkrieg and tried to warn the USSR accordingly. He was also responsible for discovering that Japan wouldn't invade Siberia. And this information allowed Stalin to transfer all his troops to the Western Front. Sorge was eventually caught by the Japanese and hanged. Despite the fact that Sorge was a spy against the Japanese, his story has been mythologized to a certain extent in modern Japan. I first heard of Sorge while reading Tezuka Osamu's famous comic book series, Adolf. It's famous in Japan. Also interesting, for a country that has a problem facing up to its war history, a sympathetic portrait of a spy against Japan seems like an odd choice for a motion picture. And there were a couple moments that marked this as a Japanese movie. For instance, there was the insistence that the British and American imperialism in Shanghai was just as bad as the Japanese. Also, there's this rather bizarre thing at the end. So, Richard Sorge has been portrayed sympathetically up in the movie up until the very end. And then right as he's about to be hanged, he says, if memory serves, he actually says this in Japanese, which is odd because for most of the movie, all of the dialogue with Richard Sorge took place in English. But this last part was in Japanese. He says, Kore wa watashi no saigo no kotaba. Kokusai kyosan shugi banzai. I think I'm remembering that right. He says, these are my last words. Long live international communism. And then those are his last words, and then he gets hanged. And then right as he says that, the movie cuts to a montage of the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. And across kind of Eastern Europe. So you see kind of these statues of Lenin's statue getting pulled down and all these kind of communist icons coming down in 1989. And I saw that and I thought, well, but that's a little bit unfair, isn't it? I mean, what they're trying to say, I think, is look at this guy. He died for nothing. You know, he died for international communism, and here we see international communism kind of coming down, and it's all a failure in 1989. But I thought, yes, but, well, I mean, what were his options? I mean, he was in Germany. I mean, he was a double citizen, but he was in Germany. So he should have become a Nazi instead of a communist? I mean, ultimately, I guess both of those ideologies kind of ended in failure. Nazism ended in failure. Communism ended in failure. But the fact that Sorge was trying to combat Nazism by kind of working for a communist spy ring in the German embassy, I just thought that was unfair. I mean, all the other Germans around him had become Nazis. Here's kind of the one guy smart enough to realize that Nazism is no good. So he. See, I just thought it was unfair to kind of pick on the fall of communism as kind of the end point to Richard Sorge's life. Although, depending on how you interpreted that last scene, you could think about it as like, how stupid he was to become a communist because kind of communism failed. Or you could say, well, what were his options? He could have become a communist, or he could have become a Nazi, or, you know, he was kind of caught in this fight between the communists and the Nazis. Maybe you could say, you know, really, everything we think is going to be a lasting ideology is just going to fall away someday. Whatever kind of cause or movement you're dedicating your life to, in 100 years, it's going to end in a disaster anyways. I don't know. Maybe that's what the movie was trying to say. Or maybe it was just a cheap shot against Richard Sorge and his communism. I don't know. But yeah, I said there was a news footage collapse on the fall of communism tacked on to the end of the movie to drive home the point that Richard Sorge had dedicated himself to a doomed ideal. In contrast, I suppose, to Nazism in Germany or the emperor worship in Japan. But yet, on the whole, it was a sympathetic portrait of Sorge and the Japanese people who gave him the information. So the Japanese, there were 5 Japanese people in Sorge's spy ring, and they're portrayed very sympathetically in the movie as well. This movie was also fascinating for a number of different reasons. Despite being a Japanese movie, it's mostly in English. Large sections of it are in English, and then if you watch this in Japan like I did, they put the Japanese subtitles at the bottom. Now, what's interesting is all the foreigners speak English. Like if they're not speaking Japanese, they're speaking English. Which means that the Russian characters and the German characters and the Czech characters are all speaking English, even when they're talking to each other. There's a scene of Stalin kind of back in the Soviet Union when he's getting Sorge's spy information. And Stalin says, "What? Hitler's going to invade the USSR? No, no, I don't believe it. I won't believe it," or something like that. And Stalin's talking in English. And I thought that was a little bit funny. I mean, like, you know, in an American movie, we have everyone speak in English because, you know, we're Americans and we're lazy and we don't want to read subtitles. So you have, you know, you'd have Joan of Arc speaking in English, or Oscar Schindler speaking in English, or everybody speaking in English in an American movie. But for a Japanese movie, I thought that was kind of an interesting take to make everyone speak English. I think maybe it just demonstrates what an international language English is becoming. Or maybe they didn't have access to actors who could speak these other languages. I thought maybe at the time that, you know, when you're in Japan, Japanese have a very binary view of the world. There's Japan, and then there's Gaikoku. Gaikoku meaning like the foreign world, the outside world. So I thought maybe this was a reflection of that, where there's Japanese, and then there's the foreign language, and the foreign language meaning English, so everyone speaks English. I don't know. Also, the dialogue and the acting for the English parts were absolutely horrible. I'm fairly sure the script wasn't written by a native English speaker. The cheesy English dialogue is almost a parody of itself. And the director apparently didn't know how to direct foreign actors either. I can only imagine the direction. Remember, the Japanese audience doesn't understand any of the words coming out of your mouth, so make sure to overact as much as possible to get the point across. I'm only half kidding. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the direction they've got. I've also seen a few other Japanese movies like this, where the foreigners are directed. The foreign actors are quite terrible, I suspect because they're getting bad direction. One is Brother, which is a Beat Takeshi film, and it's co-starring Omar Epps. It's about a Japanese gang war that spills into LA. Also has incredibly cheesy dialogue and bad acting. Of course, we Americans can be just as bad when we make movies about Japanese. Example is Rising Sun. This is a dated example now because this is quite an old movie. But just, yeah, a very cringeworthy depiction, Hollywood depiction of Japanese culture. Okay, all that being said, if you're a history nerd like I am, go out and find a copy of Spy Sorge if you can. There was a copy on YouTube last I checked. It's a fascinating movie. Just from what I can tell by researching this on the internet, it's very historically accurate, and the history parts of the movie are enough to recommend it, if nothing else. It's just very interesting history. If you're a history nerd, go check it out.